Welcome to another deep dive, and a very special welcome to you, the listener. We know you have a lot of options for where to put your attention, and we are just thrilled you decided to spend this time with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for being here.
Today, we have a very specific mission, and we are structuring this a bit like an advanced seminar. The two of us are taking on the role of your instructors for a highly specialized peer-to-peer masterclass, and it's on the architecture of IT audit engagement planning.
Right.
We're going to be diving into the definitive industry text, which is ISACA's IT Audit Framework, the 5th edition, and specifically, we are locking our focus entirely on Chapter 3. We'll be walking systematically through Performance Standard 1203 and the corresponding performance guidelines in Section 2203.
That is the agenda. And to be clear, since we know you already operate in this space, we aren't going to sit here and just, read definitions of basic terms to you.
Right, no vocab tests today.
Exactly. You already know what a SOC2 report is. You know what personally identifiable information is. And you know the fundamental difference between a standard and a guideline. Our goal in this seminar is to look at the strategy embedded in the ITF.
Yeah.
We are going to unpack the operational realities, the political friction, and the strategic complexities of actually applying this framework in a modern, highly complex enterprise environment. We will follow the exact sequence of the text, but our focus is always on the implications of those requirements.
Because whether you're an audit director trying to, align your annual plan with a massive corporate restructuring, or maybe an executive trying to understand how your third-party risk is actually being validated.
Right.
That the success or failure of any assurance engagement is entirely decided before the fieldwork even begins.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the planning phase isn't just administrative overhead, it is the architectural blueprint. If you get the planning wrong, your execution will just be a highly efficient march in the completely wrong direction.
Exactly. A flawed plan guarantees a flawed assurance outcome, regardless of the technical brilliance of the practitioners who are executing the tests.
Yeah, you can have rock stars.
Right. You can have the best cybersecurity analysts in the world, but if the engagement scope was drawn around the wrong network segment because the planning phase failed to map the business value correctly,
And what's the point?
then the entire exercise is economically worthless to the enterprise. It's just wasted time and money.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to jump right into the foundation of the syllabus, Performance Standard 1203.1, titled IT Audit and Assurance Engagement Planning Requirements.
Right.
As we all know, the 1000 series in ITAF are the shall statements. This is the mandatory ironclad rule. It states that practitioners shall plan each engagement to address the nature, timing, and extent of the procedures. Now, in the trenches, defining nature, timing, and extent is where the actual budget battles happen.
Absolutely. The standard uses that classic trinity: nature, timing, and extent. But let's really look at what that actually means strategically. When you are defining the nature of the tests, you are making a definitive claim about the level of evidence required to achieve assurance.
You're drawing a line in the sand.
You are. Are you relying on inquiry and observation, which is cheap but provides low assurance? Or are you demanding deep, substantive testing of system configurations and data analytics?
Which is highly expensive.
Very expensive. But it provides strong assurance. The framework mandates that this calibration happens immediately. You cannot stumble into fieldwork and just decide to switch from a high-level policy review to deep data mining.
Right, because you won't have the budget or the right people.
Exactly. The standard requires that commitment up front.
And that leads right into the specific components the standard demands be present in the plan. The first requirement is defining the engagement scope and objectives. This is about drawing the boundary line. But drawing that box is incredibly difficult in a highly integrated enterprise. You can't just say, we are auditing the ERP system.
You really can't. Not anymore. Modern systems are highly modular and hyper-connected via APIs. If you are auditing a specific internal application, but that application pulls its authentication protocols from a centralized identity management system,
Oh, yeah.
and its data from a separate cloud data lake, where does the scope actually end? Standard 1203.1 requires you to definitively state those boundaries and identify engagement-specific issues right away.
So you have to be explicit about what you are not looking at.
Yes. If you are deliberately excluding the identity management system from the scope because it was audited 6 months ago, that exclusion must be formally documented as part of the scope boundary. Otherwise, you expose the engagement to massive scope creep.
Which brings us to the second mandatory component, resources and scheduling. This is where the reality of the business collides with the theory of the audit. You have to map out the staff, the tools, the budget, the schedule dates. But what really stands out in the standard is the explicit requirement to consider the cost of the engagement relative to its potential benefits.
What's fascinating here is that the framework is forcing the auditor to act like an investor.
An investor, I like
Yeah,
it.
an IT audit is not free. It consumes financial resources, but more importantly, it consumes the time of the business units being audited.
Which is incredibly valuable.
Exactly. The standard is acknowledging that assurance has a price tag. If you are proposing a highly complex 6-week technical assessment of a legacy application that is scheduled to be decommissioned next quarter, the cost of that engagement wildly outweighs the benefit of the assurance provided.
So the framework is telling you to stop and think before you act.
The framework demands that the practitioner justify the economic value of the audit before a single hour is billed to the project.
I want to push back on that a bit, though. In a highly regulated environment, does the cost-benefit analysis even matter? If a regulator says you must audit this process annually, you have to do it, even if it costs more than the risk it mitigates.
That is a critical nuance, and the standard actually accommodates it. The framework separates regulatory engagements from non-regulatory ones. If it is a regulatory mandate, the benefit is essentially maintaining the legal right to operate the business.
Which has infinite value.
Exactly, infinite value. But for internal risk-based engagements, the cost-benefit analysis is paramount. You are constantly balancing the depth of the assurance against the operational drag on the enterprise.
And speaking of those regulations, the third requirement in the standard is compliance and standards. The plan has to ensure adherence to laws, regulations, and professional standards like the ITAF itself. And it mandates the use of a risk-based approach, especially for those non-regulatory engagements we just mentioned. You have to focus the firepower where the threat is highest.
Precisely. And the fourth required component is tools and methodologies. The plan must specify the relevant technology and data analysis techniques. This is a massive shift from traditional auditing.
Right, the old days of just asking for screenshots are over.
Long gone. You can't just write, "We will analyze the data." You need to specify if you are using automated process mining, specialized vulnerability scanners, or custom Python scripts for log analysis.
And why does that matter at the planning stage?
Because that fundamentally alters your resource requirements. You can't plan an engagement relying on complex data analytics if you haven't budgeted for a data scientist to be on the audit team.
Yeah, you can't assign a traditional generalist to run a machine learning anomaly detection tool and expect a defensible result.
Yeah.
A framework requires that alignment of methodology and human capital up front.
Exactly.
All right, the fifth and final component of Standard 1203.1 is communication and reporting, defining documentation needs, reporting formats. But the really critical piece here is the requirement for escalation protocols.
This is perhaps the most operationally vital part of the mandatory standard. The plan must establish communication and escalation protocols for roadblocks.
Let's talk about the political reality of those roadblocks. You and I both know that an audit is rarely a frictionless exercise. You are evaluating the controls of a business unit, and sometimes the leaders of that unit are less than cooperative.
That happens quite a bit.
Right. Suppose you are executing the plan, and the lead database administrator simply stops responding to your requests for firewall logs. They are slow-walking you. Your timeline is burning.
If you don't have a documented escalation protocol, you are in a political precarious position. If the auditor just decides to go over that administrator's head and email the chief information officer to complain, it feels like a hostile escalation. It damages the relationship.
It feels personal.
Right. But if Standard 1203.1 was followed, the escalation protocol was defined and agreed upon in advance. It removes the emotion from the conflict. The protocol simply dictates. If a requested artifact is delayed by more than 48 hours, the issue is automatically escalated to the VP of infrastructure.
Wow, yeah, it takes the heat right out of it.
It is no longer a personal battle. It is just the execution of the agreed-upon project plan.
That is the architectural beauty of it. Think about trying to build a massive skyscraper. You don't just pour the foundation and hope to steal a rides on time. You have a rigid schedule, a strict budget, and most importantly, a protocol for when the concrete truck breaks down on the highway.
You know exactly who calls the site manager.
Exactly. Who calls the backup supplier, and how it impacts the timeline for the electricians. Standard 1203 transforms an audit from an exploratory checklist into a rigorous, formal project management discipline.
It creates a legally and professionally defensible structure. If the audit fails to uncover a massive vulnerability, the first thing external regulators or the board of directors will look at is the engagement plan.
Did you follow the rules?
Did you follow Standard 1203? Did you properly resource the team? Did you define the scope appropriately based on the risk? If the plan is compliant, the failure was an operational miss. If the plan itself was chaotic and non-compliant, it is a professional failure of the audit function itself.
Okay, that covers the mandatory shall of Standard 1203. Now we transition into the 2000 series. These are the performance guidelines. This is the nuanced how-to manual for fulfilling the standard. We start with Guideline 2203.1, which serves as the introduction, and we immediately move into Guideline 2203.2, which covers objectives.
Right. Guideline 2203.2.1 states that practitioners should define and document the objectives, but the crucial insight here is that these objectives must reflect a deep understanding of the enterprise's goals, operations, and challenges.
So you can't just audit in a vacuum.
Exactly. The text specifically states the goal is to provide assurance that controls are designed appropriately and operating effectively to support those specific enterprise goals.
This represents a huge philosophical shift from legacy auditing mentalities. The objective isn't to walk in and find out what is broken. The objective is to evaluate whether the technology environment is safely enabling the business to do what it wants to do.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, an auditor who doesn't understand the enterprise goals is a dangerous liability to the business.
Liability? How so?
Imagine you are auditing a highly agile, hyper-growth tech startup. Their explicitly stated enterprise goal is rapid feature deployment and capturing market share. They deploy code to production 20 times a day.
Move fast and break things.
Right. Now, if you walk in with an audit objective designed for a 150-year-old commercial bank, demanding a 2-week change advisory board approval process for every minor code tweak, you are going to write up hundreds of critical findings.
But those findings are completely irrelevant to the business.
Exactly. You are trying to enforce a control environment that actively destroys the enterprise's primary business goal. The startup's management will entirely ignore your audit report because it lacks business context.
They'll just toss it in the bin.
Yes. The guideline insists that your objectives must align with reality. For that startup, the audit objective shouldn't be verify the existence of a slow manual change board. The objective should be verify that the automated CI/CD pipeline contains sufficient automated security testing to safely support rapid deployment.
That brings us to Guideline 2203.2.2. It states that the practitioner should develop the project plan based on those objectives. The objectives are the anchor point for everything else. They dictate the resources, the timeline, and the deliverables.
They really do.
If your objective is assessing that automated CI/CD pipeline, your plan immediately requires an auditor who understands DevSecOps. You can't staff it with someone who only knows how to audit legacy mainframe access controls.
The objectives dictate the methodology. If the objective is regulatory compliance, the deliverable must be mapped strictly to the regulatory framework, and the timeline is dictated by the regulatory filing deadline.
Right.
If the objective is internal process optimization, the deliverable might be a highly strategic advisory memo to the CIO, and the timeline is much more flexible. The plan is a derivative of the objective.
This moves us seamlessly into Section 3 of our syllabus, Performance Guideline 2W203.3, titled Scope and Business Knowledge. Guideline 2203.3.1 demands that before you scope the work, you must understand the enterprise's operations, its environment, and its risk.
You have to know the business to know what actually matters. Scoping without business knowledge is how auditors end up spending 400 hours auditing the security of the corporate cafeteria menu server while completely missing the fact that the company's entire supply chain relies on an undocumented legacy shadow IT database sitting under someone's desk.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This framework demands that the IT auditor operate as a business strategist first and a technologist second. You have to trace the flow of actual business value. How does the company make money? How does it deliver its core services?
Yeah, follow the money.
And then you follow that flow down into the technology stack. You find the technological pillars that are holding up that value. That is your scope.
That is the only way to provide meaningful assurance. The technology itself has no intrinsic value. It only exists to enable the business process.
Give me an example of that in practice.
Let's take a modern logistics enterprise. If you don't understand their operations, you might scope an audit around their standard corporate email and HR systems, because those are easy, standard IT domains.
Safe choices.
Right. But if you deeply analyze their business operations, you realize their critical competitive advantage is a highly proprietary, real-time weather and traffic routing algorithm that dictates fleet movements.
Oh, wow.
The failure of that algorithm costs them millions of dollars a day. That algorithm, its inputs, its security, and its resilience, that is the critical scope.
But how does an auditor actually gain that level of business knowledge during the planning phase before the fieldwork even starts? You aren't embedded in the logistics division.
The framework expects the practitioner to do the pre-work. This means reviewing strategic business plans, interviewing business unit leaders, not just IT leaders, analyzing previous risk assessments, and understanding the industry landscape.
You have to do your homework.
You have to speak the language of the business unit you are auditing. If you walk into a scoping meeting with the head of logistics and start asking about firewall port configurations instead of asking about the data latency of their fleet telematics, you immediately lose credibility.
So, assuming we have done the work, we understand the business strategy, and we have drafted our objectives. Now we have to figure out what threatens those objectives. This brings us to Section 4 of our deep dive. Performance Guideline 2203.4, the risk-based approach.
This is the absolute core of modern IT auditing. Guidelines 2203.4.1 and 2203.4.2 require practitioners to assess and prioritize identified risk at two distinct levels: the specific area under review and the broader enterprise IT environment.
Let's explore the tension there. Why both levels?
Because a risk might be highly critical to a specific system, but largely irrelevant to the enterprise as a whole. Conversely, a minor vulnerability in a low-level system might cascade into a catastrophic failure for the entire enterprise.
Right, the butterfly effect.
Exactly. You have to prioritize based on the ultimate impact. You cannot treat every risk equally because you do not have infinite resources.
Which leads directly into Guideline 2203.4.3, establishing planning materiality levels. The concept of materiality is fundamental. The framework provides a very clear example here. During a data governance audit, practitioners are evaluating data management controls. The text explicitly states that datasets containing personally identifiable information PII require greater materiality than other datasets due to strict regulatory requirements and a high reputational and compliance risk.
Materiality is the threshold at which a control failure actually matters to the stakeholders. And what is vital here is that the guideline requires us to look at both quantitative and qualitative factors.
Right, it's not just a numbers game.
Exactly. Quantitatively, materiality might be defined as any financial error over $1 million, but qualitatively, materiality is far more complex.
Walk us through that PII example.
Let's use it. Suppose a company has a massive data warehouse with 1 billion rows of anonymized consumer behavior data. Quantitatively, it is huge. They also have a tiny, isolated database containing the highly sensitive, unencrypted medical histories of their top 50 executives.
Only 50 records.
Quantitatively, 50 records is a rounding error. It is statistically zero. But qualitatively, the reputational damage, the potential blackmail leverage, the regulatory fallout from the breach of those 50 records is astronomical.
Yeah, that's a nightmare scenario.
Therefore, the materiality of that tiny database is extremely high. The engagement plan must reflect that by assigning senior resources and deep substantive testing to that specific microenvironment, while perhaps using lighter, automated analytical testing on the billion-row warehouse.
That is a brilliant distinction. The context dictates the materiality, not just the volume. Now, Guideline 2203.4.4 introduces another massive risk driver: compliance with laws and standards. It notes that noncompliance must be treated as a key risk factor that dictates scope and resource allocation.
We touched on this earlier, but it deserves a deeper look. Regulatory compliance is the ultimate qualitative risk. If an enterprise operates in the European Union, the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, isn't just a best practice, it is a legal mandate with fines that can reach 4% of global revenue.
Which is massive.
If the auditor knows the enterprise has struggled with data subject access requests in the past, that area of noncompliance is a flashing red light on the risk map. The engagement plan must aggressively allocate resources to test the specific workflows and data retention schedules associated with that regulation.
But wait, if the audit function is purely internal, doesn't heavily focusing on compliance turn the internal audit team into just another branch of the legal department? Shouldn't they be focused on operational IT risk?
That is a common debate in the industry. But the ITAF perspective is that regulatory noncompliance is a massive operational IT risk.
So is it the bottom line?
Because it hits the bottom line and because of the operational mechanics. If the legal department says, we must delete customer data upon request within 30 days, that is a legal requirement. But executing that deletion across 50 disparate interconnected databases without breaking referential integrity is a highly complex IT operational challenge.
That makes perfect sense. The legal team writes the policy, IT builds the mechanism, and the auditor tests the mechanism. The auditor isn't acting as a lawyer. The auditor is validating that the IT environment is actually capable of executing the legal mandate.
Precisely.
The final piece of this risk-based section is Guideline 2203.4.5, Evaluate Internal Controls. The standard requires a preliminary assessment of existing controls during the planning phase.
This is about efficiency. You have to look at what management is already doing. The framework provides a highly practical example. Consider an IT audit supporting a financial statement audit. The auditors need to verify the account provisioning procedures, how users are granted access to the financial systems.
The text states that if those systems have weak controls, the auditors must increase their testing. If they have strong controls, the auditors can reduce testing.
Which sounds obvious, but the mechanics of how you determine that during the planning phase are complex. How do you know if the controls are strong before you've actually audited them?
Right. If you are just in the planning phase, aren't you just taking management's word for it?
You rely on preliminary assessments. You look at the results of last year's audit. You look at the volume of help desk tickets related to access errors. You look at the automated continuous monitoring dashboards.
I see.
If the dashboards show that 99.9% of access requests are flowing through the automated role-based approval matrix without exception, you have a high preliminary confidence in that control. You plan to do a small sample test to confirm the dashboard is accurate. You reduce your testing.
But if you look at the help desk logs and see that the IT team is constantly manually overriding the provisioning system to grant emergency access to the financial database, your preliminary assessment is that the control environment is chaotic and weak.
Exactly. And because the control is weak, the risk of unauthorized access is high. Therefore, the engagement plan must be adjusted to dramatically increase the extent of the testing.
You have to look at everything.
You can't rely on a small sample. You might need to extract the entire user directory and run full population data analytics to identify every single active orphaned account. The preliminary assessment directly dictates the volume of work required.
I think the through line here is becoming very clear. The planning phase is a highly dynamic, strategic process of resource allocation based on a deep contextual understanding of business risk. So let's transition to Section 5, Performance Guideline 2203.5. This is where all this strategy gets codified. The section is titled Documenting the Project Plan and Audit Program.
Up until this point, we've been discussing the intellectual exercise of planning. Now we move to the artifact. Guideline 2203.5.1 dictates that the project plan must be included in the work papers. It is the official, permanent record.
And Guideline 2203.5.2 lists the terms of reference that must be documented. We aren't going to just read the list, but we need to examine the purpose behind these requirements. The plan must explicitly detail the scope, the objectives, and the type of work. It must detail the information gathering process, meaning you have to specifically document who you plan to interview and what verification procedures you will use.
The documentation of fact-finding interviews is critical. You are planning the human interaction of the audit. If you are auditing cloud security, you cannot just list interview IT staff.
All right, that's too vague.
You must specify, conduct walkthrough of IAM configurations with the lead cloud architect. This ensures that you have identified the right stakeholders and secured their time in advance. It prevents the audit from stalling because the one person who understands the architecture is on a 3-week vacation.
The guideline also requires documenting the resources, budget, allocation, timeline, and deliverables. We've discussed this, but seeing it mandated as a formal document reinforces that the audit is a corporate project subject to standard project management rigor. But the requirement that I really want to dive deeply into is the mandate to document external reports available that can be relied upon. The source text specifically mentions an SSAE 18 report.
This is one of the most powerful efficiency levers in the entire framework, but it is also one of the most dangerous if executed poorly. An SSA 18 or the resulting SOC reports are attestations of the controls at a service organization.
Let's construct a scenario here to really analyze this. You are planning the audit of your enterprise's payroll process, but your enterprise doesn't process its own payroll. You outsource it to a massive global human capital management vendor. You obviously cannot send your internal audit team to their global data centers to test their physical server racks.
Right. So the framework allows you to rely on external work. You request the vendor's SOC2 Type 2 report, which was prepared by an independent external auditor. That report verifies that the vendor's data center security, availability, and processing integrity controls are operating effectively.
So you just document that.
You document in your project plan that you are relying on that SOC2 report for those specific control domains, and you exclude the vendor's internal infrastructure from your testing scope. You just saved hundreds of hours of audit budget.
But here's a friction. I've seen teams just get the SOC2 report, see that it has an unqualified opinion, attach it to the work paper, and declare victory. But that blind reliance introduces a massive blind spot, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, and the ITAF expects a much higher level of rigor. You cannot just rubber stamp an external report. The planning phase must include the time and resources required to actually analyze that SOC2. First, does the period of the report actually align with your audit period?
Good point.
If you are auditing the calendar year 2025, but the SOC2 report covers October 2023 to September 2024, there is a massive gap in assurance. You have to plan for how you will gain comfort over that gap, perhaps by requesting a bridge letter from the vendor.
And what about the complementary user entity controls, the CUECs?
Exactly. That is the trap. The vendor's SOC2 report will explicitly state, our controls are only effective if the user entity or enterprise implements specific controls on their end.
Give me an example.
For example, the vendor system is secure, provided that your enterprise enforces strong password policies and immediately revokes access for terminated employees.
So you carve out the vendor's data center from your scope, but your project plan must explicitly include substantive testing of your internal procedures for provisioning access to that vendor's platform. You inherit the responsibility to test the CUECs. If the project plan just says relying on SOC2 without mapping out the testing for the corresponding internal controls, the plan is fundamentally broken.
It is a critical mapping exercise. The reliance on external work isn't a free pass. It is a shift in focus. Moving down the guidelines, 2203.5.3 and 2203.5.4 focus on mapping out the timeline, budget, and the specific sequence of testing steps. You are creating the step-by-step instruction manual for the fieldwork.
And then we reach guidelines 2203.5.5 through 2203.5.7, which cover deliverables, management approval, and auditee communication. Guideline 2203.5.7 is entirely about professional courtesy and operational efficiency. It mandates that relevant parts of the approved plan, the scope, timelines, document needs, must be communicated to the auditee so they can prepare.
We touched on this briefly earlier, but it is worth exploring the psychology of this requirement. The historical stereotype of an auditor is the adversary, the internal police force that shows up unannounced to catch you making a mistake. The ITAF actively works to dismantle that dynamic.
Because that dynamic is incredibly inefficient.
Yeah.
If you show up unannounced and demand 5 years of complex system logs, the auditee's immediate reaction is defensive. They will give you exactly what you asked for and nothing more, even if they know you're asking the wrong question.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, if you follow Guideline 2203.5.7, you share the plan transparently. You say, here is our objective. We are trying to validate the resilience of the network architecture. Here is our timeline. Here are the specific architecture diagrams and firewall rule sets we will need.
You bring them into the process.
You transform the relationship from an adversarial interrogation into a collaborative verification exercise.
The auditees are the subject matter experts. They have day jobs. If you need their lead architect for a 3-hour whiteboard session, they need to schedule that. If you respect their time by communicating the plan in advance, they are far more likely to proactively point out risks or efficiencies that you missed during your preliminary scoping. The transparency generates better assurance.
It does. But as we all know, no matter how perfectly documented and collaboratively communicated a project plan is, it rarely survives contact with reality untouched.
Which brings us to Section 6. Performance Guideline 2203.6 changes during the course of the audit. The framework recognizes that the IT environment is incredibly fluid. Guideline 2203.6 dictates that the project plan must be updated and formally approved by management if new concerns arise once the audit is underway.
The plan is a baseline, not a straitjacket. Suppose your plan is strictly focused on auditing the logical access controls of a specific customer relationship management or CRM system. During your fieldwork, while reviewing a user access list, you notice that a legacy unencrypted database is somehow directly querying the CRM and extracting customer data without passing through any of the authentication gateways you are currently testing.
You've just stumbled onto a massive architectural vulnerability that was completely outside your defined scope.
Right. You cannot simply ignore it because it wasn't in the plan. That would be a failure of professional duty. But you also cannot just start spending 80 hours auditing that legacy database in secret because you will blow your budget, miss your deadlines for the CRM audit, and violate the agreed upon terms of reference.
So the framework provides the mechanism. You pause. You go back to IT audit management. You present the new concern. The guideline says you have options. You can formally update the current project plan to expand the scope to include that legacy database, meaning you get approval for more budget and a timeline extension. Or, if that expansion would derail the current critical deliverables too much, you formalize a recommendation to schedule a separate, targeted assessment for that legacy database at a later date.
And critically, Guideline 23203.6.2 demands that you assess the impact of these changes and communicate them to the auditee. If you expand the scope to include that legacy database, you must tell the business unit leader. You cannot just ambush them with findings on a system they didn't know you were looking at.
Let's look at Guideline 2203.6.3, which deals with unexpected events. It says the plan must allow for risk-based prioritization when massive unexpected external or internal events imply new risk for the enterprise.
This is where the agility of the audit function is truly tested. Let's run a realistic scenario. You are the lead auditor for a multinational retailer. Your meticulously approved project plan has you 3 weeks into a deep dive audit of internal network segmentation. It is a highly technical, resource-intensive engagement.
Okay, set the scene. Suddenly, the news breaks. A catastrophic zero-day vulnerability has just been discovered in a wildly popular open-source web server application, an application that your enterprise uses extensively across its entire e-commerce perimeter. The vulnerability is being actively exploited in the wild. Competitors are reporting massive data exfiltration.
The risk profile of your enterprise just altered fundamentally in a matter of minutes. The risk of an external breach via that zero-day vulnerability is now exponentially higher and far more urgent than the theoretical internal risks associated with your network segmentation audit.
Under the rigid, old-school mentality, you would just put your head down and finish the segmentation audit, because that's the plan, while the enterprise burns around you. But under Guideline 2203.6.3, you leverage risk-based prioritization.
You immediately trigger your escalation protocols. You convene with audit leadership and the Chief Information Security Officer. You formally pause the segmentation audit, effectively freezing the project plan. You rapidly draft a dynamic, highly targeted engagement plan to assess the enterprise's exposure to this specific zero-day vulnerability, evaluate the emergency patching protocols, and verify the integrity of the perimeter controls.
You pivot the entire weight of your assurance resources toward the immediate existential threat. And because you're operating within the framework, you document why the pivot occurred, you document the reallocation of the budget, and you maintain complete visibility with the governance board. The framework provides the structural discipline required to be agile without descending into chaos.
That is the perfect summary of this section. Discipline flexibility.
All right, we are entering the final and, frankly, the most forward-looking section of our masterclass, Section 7. Performance Guideline 2203.7, Other Considerations. This section contains the guidance that truly separates a modern, high-functioning audit capability from a legacy compliance shop.
Guideline 2203.7.1 is a comprehensive catch-all that details vital coordination requirements. It emphasizes understanding the subject, explicitly directing auditors to map out relevant legislation, directives, and industry guidelines. We have discussed compliance, but this goes deeper. It means understanding the evolving regulatory landscape before it becomes law.
It also reiterates documenting the plan using formal project management methodologies. But I want to spend significant time on the subtopic of reliance on external work. We explored the SOC2 example earlier, but the source text provides another critical example, relying on a PCI DSS audit for a payment gateway.
The payment card industry data security standard. This is a perfect example of strategic boundary mapping. If your enterprise processes credit cards, you are subject to PCI DSS. It is an incredibly prescriptive, highly technical standard. If your enterprise uses a third-party payment gateway, and that gateway has a current independent report on compliance for PCI DSS.
The IT audit function can legitimately exclude the payment gateway infrastructure from their current engagement.
Yes. But just like the SOC2, the strategic difficulty is in the boundaries. The third party's PCI audit only covers their environment. It does not cover how your enterprise's web application securely passes the credit card token to their gateway. It does not cover the physical security of your retail point-of-sale terminals. The engagement plan must meticulously carve out the external reliance while aggressively targeting the internal integration points.
The final subtopic under 22203.7.1 is engagement letters, preparing separate letters for internal and external audits to clarify involvement and ensure access. It's the formal contract of the audit. But let's move to Guideline 2203.7.2. This is the addition to the 5th edition that truly reflects the current reality of technology. It specifically addresses AI audit guidance.
This is a monumental shift. The guideline explicitly recognizes that artificial intelligence and AI-enabled systems introduce fundamentally unique risks that cannot be addressed by traditional IT audit checklists. When planning an engagement involving AI, practitioners must reference current ISACA AI audit guidance.
Let's dive deep into the strategic complexity of this. How does scoping an AI audit differ from scoping a traditional software audit?
It requires a paradigm shift. Traditional software is deterministic. If you input A, the code executes a defined logical path and it outputs B every single time. Auditing a deterministic system is about validating the logical pathways and the access controls protecting the code.
But AI, particularly machine learning or large language models, is probabilistic and non-deterministic. If you input A, it might output B today, but based on continuous learning and weight adjustments, it might output C tomorrow. You cannot just audit the source code because the code isn't making the decision. The trained model weights are making the decision.
Exactly. So during the planning phase, the practitioner has to define entirely new categories of scope and objectives. You have to plan to assess algorithmic bias. How do you test if a machine learning model used for HR resume screening is systematically discriminating against a protected class? That requires planning for complex statistical disparity testing, not just checking user access logs.
You have to plan to assess data provenance. Where did the training data come from? Do we have the legal right to use it? Has the training data been poisoned by a malicious actor? You also have to assess the opacity of the model. If a neural network denies a customer a loan, can the enterprise actually explain why the loan was denied to a regulator? The black box problem is a massive compliance risk.
The planning phase must acknowledge that you need specialized data scientists, ethicists, and legal counsel involved in the audit. You need specialized testing environments. You cannot treat an AI model like a standard relational database. And Guideline 2203.7.2 explicitly mandates that practitioners seek out specialized guidance to build these complex engagement plans.
It is a whole new frontier for assurance. And that transitions perfectly into the final guideline, 2203.7.3, Technology-Enabled Engagement Planning. The framework is stating that the act of planning itself must evolve beyond static spreadsheets and whiteboards.
The guideline pushes practitioners to use technology to drive the planning process. This includes using data-driven risk assessments. We touched on this with the preliminary control assessment, but this implies a much broader application of analytics.
Right. Instead of just interviewing business leaders to ask them where they think the risk is, you actually plug an analytics engine into the enterprise data lake during the planning phase. You look for anomalies across the entire IT landscape before you even define your scope.
If the data-driven assessment reveals a massive unexplained spike in data exfiltration alerts originating from a newly acquired subsidiary, a subsidiary that nobody in corporate leadership mentioned during the fact-finding interviews, your analytics have just autonomously identified a critical risk area. The engagement scope dynamically shifts to target that subsidiary. The data tells you where to look, rather than relying purely on human intuition.
The text also emphasizes integrating continuous auditing and continuous monitoring dashboards into the planning phase.
Continuous auditing fundamentally changes the timeline. Historically, an audit is a point-in-time exercise. You audit the firewall configurations in March, you issue a report in April, and you assume the configurations remain secure until next March. Continuous monitoring tools are validating those configurations every 5 minutes.
So how does an auditor plan an engagement in an environment that is constantly self-reporting its compliance status?
The nature of the audit changes. You don't plan to manually test the firewall rules. You plan an engagement to audit the integrity, the calibration, and the alert routing logic of the continuous monitoring system itself. You audit the watcher. If you can prove the continuous monitoring tool is perfectly configured and its alerts cannot be suppressed or ignored by management, you can provide continuous assurance over the entire perimeter. The planning phase becomes focused on systems-level architecture rather than transaction-level testing.
So what does this all mean? It means the ITAF is pushing the profession toward a highly sophisticated, data-driven, mathematically rigorous approach to assurance. Engagement planning is no longer administrative paperwork. It is complex, technology-enabled project management.
It requires the practitioner to be a business strategist, a project manager, a risk analyst, and a technologist, all before a single test is formally executed.
Well, we have reached the end of the syllabus. We have systematically unpacked Chapter 3, Standard 1203, and the entirety of Guidelines 2203. Let's synthesize this for our peers tuning in.
The core takeaway from this deep dive into the ITF planning standards is that the effectiveness of the assurance you provide is entirely bounded by the quality of your plan. Standard 1203 and Guideline 2203 are not bureaucratic hurdles. They are a systematic framework for aligning the immense power of an IT audit with the strategic realities and risks of the enterprise. A plan that is rigorous, risk-based, beautifully documented, collaboratively communicated, and dynamically adaptable is the only mechanism that transforms raw technical testing into actual, valuable business assurance.
Without the discipline of this framework, an audit is just a chaotic exploration of technology. With it, an audit is a targeted strategic validation of enterprise capability. Before we wrap up this advanced seminar, we always like to leave you with a final provocative thought, something that stretches the boundaries of what we've discussed today. We just spent significant time on Guideline 2.203.7.3 discussing data-driven risk assessments, continuous monitoring integration, and the complexities of AI.
This raises an important existential question for the profession. If enterprises are deploying pervasive continuous monitoring networks that evaluate risk in real time across millions of endpoints, and if we're integrating advanced artificial intelligence into the governance frameworks, could we reach a point where the technology itself autonomously scopes and drafts the audit project plan?
Think about the logical conclusion of technology-enabled engagement planning. Will there be a future where the IT auditor doesn't conduct scoping interviews or manually calculate materiality? Instead, you log in on a Monday morning, and an enterprise AI, having continuously ingested global threat intelligence, internal network telemetry, and the shifting regulatory landscape over the weekend, has dynamically generated a perfectly calibrated, risk-based project plan.
The AI says, based on a 400% increase in sophisticated phishing attempts against the logistics division observed in the last 72 hours, combined with their deployment of an unpatched legacy routing algorithm, I have scoped a targeted assessment. Here are the precise objectives: the required data analytics scripts, the optimized resource allocation, and the predefined escalation protocols. Press approve to deploy the automated testing routines.
Will the future auditor's role in the planning phase simply be to act as the human governance layer, reviewing and authorizing the strategic scope defined by an autonomous system? The tools of assurance are evolving exponentially, and based on the trajectory of this framework, the blueprint of the future might draw itself.
It is a profound evolution to consider. The line between the system being audited and the system conducting the audit is beginning to blur.
Seminar dismissed. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the architecture of IT audit planning. We hope you walk away with a renewed perspective on the strategic power of the planning phase. Keep pushing the boundaries, keep analyzing the risks, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.